welcome to this episode of the At Sea Podcast. I'm your host, Justin McRoberts. This is my co-host and producer and guest, Dan Portnoy. We are walking through the book Sacred Strides. Dan is asking questions. We're kind of re-narrating this thing because I think it's a really cool book, and I'd like to get it in your life some way, shape, or form. So Dan has known me for a very long time. We've been partners for, goodness gracious, like a couple decades, and done a bunch of different work together. And so he has a pretty unique take on my work and what I'm doing with it. And it's been fun to walk through these chapters and have Dan point stuff out and show me where I could have made this a better project.
What a terrible podcast this is.
It's a terrible podcast.
It's terrible.
Let's talk about all the things we missed in chapter 7.
What could you have done? This book could have been great.
It could have been great. That's the podcast name. Sacred Strides could have been great. I could have been somebody. But we are in chapter 7.
Yes, and I thought we should back it way up. What is
Go.
a book? No, I'm kidding.
Yes, we should do that, actually.
Why don't we just start there? So it's
Yep.
a collection of stories.
Yes.
Okay. So in this chapter 7, tripping over myself, or the worst snow trip ever, and discovering I am the gift.
Yes.
So it was like frankincense, gold, myrrh.
Me,
you.
Merc Roberts.
Yeah, Merc Rob.
Merc Roberts. Frankincense,
Roberts.
gold, and Merc Roberts.
Yes. I saw a thing. It was like, you think they ever get back together and they're like, hey man, remember when we went to that manger and saw that kid? That was crazy.
That was crazy. How do you think that went? I don't know. Poor kid.
So here we are. You're talking, which is really funny because I know your first line here is I'll be 49 when the book is published. And
Yes.
here we are a year later.
A year later. I'm now 50.
A year later. And
Yeah.
wow. And you talk about the year of Jubilee.
Yep.
So everyone has to give their gifts back to you, including 100 mini Slinkies. Man,
That goes back to chapter 6. In chapter 6, we're talking about like my value system and how like I sold a bunch of stuff so that I could live my life at my pace, and and that I got to be friends with people who are running the same pace. Stavros and I came upon Christmas, and we were like, what are we gonna do? We have because we did have tons of friends, all these friends, and like, what are we gonna do? Like, we legit started climbing through the dumpsters behind the Toys R Us, and we found trash bags full of Slinkies, hundreds of Slinkies, and we gave away lots and lots and lots of Slinkies for Christmas one year. I also found a massive, like a huge, like mechanical screwdriver. It was like super duper long. And I was like, well, that's gonna be a gift. I think I gave that to a pastor friend or something like that. But like, we dumpster dove for Christmas gifts and loved it. And people were stoked. It's perfect.
So then, and the story that you're going to tell us here about this is not only about a whole bunch of guys, but you have so tell us about this trip that's coming up that you're trying to get the money for, and everything is crazy, but you've got so just give us a rundown.
So there are a couple elements to this. So the kids that showed up to my Young Life Club tended to be kids that didn't have a whole lot of money, and one of the gifts that of not needing a whole lot, because I had a 90-pound sack of rice and $200 rent, was that even though I wasn't pulling in a ton of money, I got to set money aside and help kids get places. And so, like a ski trip would be, however much money for a ski trip, or taking kids to camp. It's, you've got to put down $150 deposit. None of these kids or their parents had that money, and I was able to like squirrel money away or ask donors for a little extra money to get kids there. This ski trip was transformative for me in a lot of ways. And we talked again in chapter 6 about transactional relationships. It is one of the sad realities of adult life is that most of our relationships are if not fundamentally, are like predominantly transactional, and that those relationships exist because there's an exchange of goods, or there's there you have a particular value to this culture, these people. And so my relationship to these kids, as I understood it, was very transactional. It was like I could get them to camp. I could provide a space for them to be. That's not true, but that was like in my head. I wouldn't have called it transactional at the time, but I was able to provide something, and that's what provided that was my worth there. What I was what I was doing, though, without knowing it, is that I was sort of like over identifying. Like that was true of me in relationship to these kids, but that wasn't true of me, um like at the root level. Like my actual value as a person wasn't just that I was able to provide things for kids. So this is where the story sort of comes in. So we decided to take these kids on a ski trip, snow trip. Most of them snowboarded, kind of, and we were double booked in the cabin, and the other group that came up that we were double booked with. They had more kids and bigger kids. It was my buddy Grant Hadasaki, who's still a dear friend, and he brought up a bunch of guys from East Palo Alto who play football. So it was like 20 or some odd like Tongan guys. And these Tongan men were like, they're all like 6 foot ish, at least 180 to 220. Like this is big football player. And all my guys are like little skate punks, 85 pounds to 120 pounds soaking wet. And so they show up after we're there, and we're like, what are we gonna do? There are only so many beds. And I'm like, hey, you know what? We'll leave the main floor because there was a basement. I'm like, we'll just sleep in the basement. And I don't know this when I say that because I hadn't done the research, which was very me at the time. Like I'm just gonna make a decision and figure out how it goes after that. Usually it works out. Well, we got downstairs, and when I say basement, you might imagine like stairs that go down to a place that has like rooms. Well, they were working on the place, and so the basement had not been finished. So there was drywall, and there wasn't a lot of insulation. There was some insulation, there wasn't a lot of insulation, and the rooms were just framed, so it was just the 2 by 4 frames,
Mhm.
concrete floor, and, like, but I'd already committed us to being there. So I
Sleeping on the
take my
slab.
kids. We're sleeping on a cold slab, and the group was made up of like 14 to 15 guys, and then one girl. I had one girl who was willing to hang out with this 14, 15, and her name was Leah. And Leah was the toughest person in club, mainly because she was able to like hang with this group of like farty, like smoker kid, like guys. So, anyways, um, I had to get a friend to come on the trip. I think it was like the one and only thing she ever did was help me out with this trip. She's like, "I'm never doing ministry with you again. It was terrible. Those kids are awful, and we were sleeping on a hard floor." So I don't sleep that first night because not only is it's cold, it's like really, really cold because it's like 14, 15 degrees outside up in Tahoe. But I'm also feeling terrible because like one, like I double booked the cabin. Which like I'm sure I'm positive that was my mistake. I double booked the cabin, and then I compromised and I put my kids in a position to like have to sleep on a floor which is cold. Like I'm feeling like I'm terrible at this job. Um, I feel like a failure. So the next morning, to add insult to injury, we get upstairs, and Grant and his crew, they're making breakfast. We slept in a little bit, shocking. And Grant says, "Hey, we do this like morning check-in thing before we go." I was planning on just like grabbing some food, go to the mountain, get in the snow. But Grant's like, "Yeah, we do this like morning check-in," which is like actual leadership. So now I feel worse. It's like I don't even have a plan to do anything of actual value. Yeah, I'm like, "Yeah, let's." He's like, "Join us." So we sit, and all my kids are like clustered in one little group off in the corner, and then like the army of Tongan men that Grant brought are like sitting together, and Grant's asking actual questions about spiritual life stuff, like what would you ask God if you had one question? Like, what does prayer mean? And his kids are answering. They're used to this kind of conversation. And I've had, and my kids and I would have decent conversations, but this was like, he was and still is like a truly amazing leader of people. And so he's drawing all this wonderful stuff out of his kids. And they're like, oh, I would want to know, like, my grandma died and like, why'd she have to die when she died? And, or like, what is cancer about? Like all these, like, wow, this is like profound stuff. And my kids are like, I don't know. I would ask God if he passes gas. And I was like, gosh, stop asking my kids questions. This is so embarrassing. So, at some point, he he doesn't quit on the thing. Like I'm embarrassed and I just want the thing to end. But again, he was a better leader than I was and expected more. And I think more to the point, he just had a different perspective on what it meant to be there. So he goes back to my kids. He goes, I haven't heard a whole lot from this group. Um, why do you come to Young Life at all? Why do you come to these things? What's this about for you? And I honestly, it could have sounded like, "Why are you here if you don't wanna be here?" kinda thing. There was more love in his voice when he said it. But the way I hear it is like, they're just gonna, they're gonna, they're gonna crap all over me right now, this is awful. So it's quiet for a long time. And Leah, this girl who had just spent the night on a concrete floor freezing, up there with 14 guys, with a leader that doesn't wanna be with her. She goes, um, "Honestly, I think I speak for all of us when I say, like, we just like hanging out with Justin." And it wasn't like an ego boost. I was like, "Yeah, of course," because I wasn't feeling like that. I was feeling like
Mhm.
I'm bad at this. I'm not a good, like, I wasn't expecting it. It was it was like this seed of truth that probably wouldn't have actually, like, found soil, like, good soil in me had I not felt like a failure. Like, I had done everything wrong, and this kid's like, "I'm just here to hang out with you." And had someone told me previous to that, like, "Well, you're the gift that you're offering these kids," I would be like, "That's a neat sentiment." But all, like, right there in the midst of, like, "Oh, no, you're a pretty bad young life leader. You double book the cabin, you compromise on your kids, you just scrape some female leader like, off off a wall in some church somewhere to, like, bring up to hang out with this one girl. Like, you're not good at this job." In the midst of all that, this kid is saying, like, "No, you're why I show up." And it reoriented for me, and not in a moment, but it planted the seed of reorientation for me, that if that's true, and it is true, then then that reframes my successes and my failures. That reframes the way I understand what I do and, like, the value of what I do. Do I get to try to bring great gifts to the table and love people well with great gifts? Absolutely. But is my value predicated on those great gifts, or is my value predicated on, like, me providing gifts as a way for me to offer more of myself to the world, and that's actually what God's been up to? That's like, that was a moment for me in which it started to reset why I do any of the stuff I do technically. So that's why the story's in the book.
So, but, like, this is all happening. What did Grant say to all that? Like, what did his other kids say?
Oh man, honestly, like, that, I don't remember much that happened after that because my brain was just a buzz. It was just like I was sort of stopped in time. Um, I mean, I've talked to him a few times since then. I mean, I've obviously had to pass this chapter on to him before I publish it. And be like, "Hey, you're going to be in a book," and he remembers this time. Like, he remembers this, that cabin trip, and he remembers feeling for me like obviously, I shouldn't say obviously, I was predictably, like, I was a nervous wreck, and I was like barely present. And he felt for me. He's like, "Dude, like, these kids, like, loved hanging out with you, and you were so distracted by, like, trying to do the job right, that, like, you didn't, like, you weren't seeing how, like, cool, not cool, like, how much they cared about being around." They didn't actually think I was cool. They were all cooler than I was. But they liked me.
Sure.
You didn't even see, like, they really just liked being with you. And so I loved that moment for you. So he remembers that then. I don't remember much from I remember some of the time on the hill, but, like, my mind was abuzz at being, like, spoken truth to.
Okay. Now,
Yeah.
yeah, I think that's a tough one when you're focused on the well, it's so normal to be focused kind of on the wrong things. Anyway, when you're early in leadership and you're trying to check all the boxes and do all the things, and then here comes Grant, who's obviously, I mean, Grant is what, 5 to 10 years older.
Oh, yeah, more than that, yeah.
Yeah, so he's been doing a lot longer, and
Yep.
he's making it look easy, and because he's already had all those experiences, and then
Yeah.
and you're doing the comparison. Meanwhile, your kids aren't even thinking about any of that and don't
No.
care about any of that, which is hilarious. Except they probably care about sleeping on the slab
They
because
weren't
that's not
stoked
fun
about
for
that.
anyone. Nobody's excited about that. No one's going to be excited about that.
No,
So,
and part of what Grant had been through, I mean, he should probably write a book of his own. This is a guy he's good at what he does because of the posture that he was living in. And the posture he was living in, like, he wasn't attached to, like, particular successes and failures. He cares about doing things well, but he had failed enough to, like, be on the other side of moments like I was in, and know that, like, it's his presence that actually mattered. N and I've taught this for a long time, and I teach it because I need to remember it. There are lessons that we really only learn, by doing something we think by doing something well, or thinking we're doing something well and then failing. There are lessons we only learn by doing things, like, we care about and then blowing it, and then, like, sifting through the pieces afterwards to discover, like, what was actually there. And the thing we discover over the course of time, either because we fail at things we care about, or we become kind of numb to our successes, is that we're the gift that we're offering. That it's always about the people doing the work, and almost never about the work itself. It's always about human connection. It's always that you're the thing that's actually being established in a place rather than just to work. I think we almost only I think we almost always need to fail at something in order to come to that knowledge, and then have someone around us say, like, no, 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 what mattered was that you were here and you were present. Like, it takes us failing to get to that truth, I think.
yeah, I mean, we're not going to learn on the mountaintop. That's I think the reality is that we only learn those lessons in the valley and when things are terrible.
Yeah.
Mostly because we're like, oh, now I've traveled this road. Because how are you going to be able to? I think this is why, because this happens with my kids all the time. They'll like try something brand new and they fail at it, and I'm like, yeah, of course you did. I mean, have you ever done this before? And they're like,
Yeah.
no. Have you ever been a high school senior before? And they're like, no. I'm like, well, of course, that's terrible. Like, yeah, that that's what I don't understand that, and I don't understand why there's like such pressure like for perfection there, and
Yes.
I think that's wild. And I also think it's weird that there's that like that adage like if at first you don't succeed, like who are these people that are succeeding the first time? Like that's not even real.
And I think the high school parallel is really key, because by the time you figure out how to do your senior year well, you're
Yep,
done. And you
you're a
gotta go
freshman in
be a
college.
freshman again.
Yeah,
And by the and the
exactly.
by the t and then by the time you figure out how to be a freshman well,
Yep,
you're a sophomore. And so
yep.
every season you're in always preps you for the next season. So if you predicate, like, what success means on if my metric for success is, like, getting the season I'm in right, I'm gonna constantly feel like I'm behind. But if I can
Hmm.
reorient that and know that, like, the season I'm in preps me for the next season, not so that I can get the next season right, but so that I would continue to become the person I'm becoming. If I can reorient myself to, like, I'm the gift, I'm the thing being developed. The lessons I learn now make me a richer, better, deeper, more loving and caring person in the next season. And then I will learn new lessons, and I will have different successes and different failures in the next season. And the point of that season will be to prep me for the next season so that I'm more the person I'm becoming. If I can make it about my becoming and make it about me being the gift, then I can let go of the attachment I have to my successes and failures, and I can just learn. I can learn
Mhm.
from my successes and learn from my failures. Like, this is part of the, half the book is about work. Again, there are things there are things we learn in rest that we only learn by stopping and like letting our lives catch up with us. There are also things we learn by only learn in work. And part of like how we work out our identity and how we work out our own value is by actually thinking and making the mistake of like overvaluing our productivity or overvaluing the product we're making, and then that thing failing and discovering ourselves and our own growth pattern in the middle of it. So we learn ourselves in work, and I think that ends up being the ball game.
Yeah, yeah. I find just a key word for me is adventure versus because I'll be doing something and I have usually Griswoldian expectations on things. That's the joke around here that like Clark Griswold, I've just like this is how things are supposed to be. We're gonna do this.
Yes.
And then, of course, that goes to crap, like because I have 3 kids, and so and they've got new ideas, and they're socially awkward, and then they're just like, one of them shut their brain off, and they're just zombies and stuff, and I'm like, what the heck is going on?
Yep.
And my wife will just be like, adventure. This is an adventure we're having, and I'm
Yes.
like, oh, because adventures, who knows what's going to happen, right? Like
100%.
that.
I love
That
that.
that's a great thing.
I like that
So that
reorientation.
makes yeah. It helps pretty quick. Now, this seems like kind of a turning point moment in the book. I
Yes.
feel like that this is like you're kind of onto something, like you're starting to pull a thread um here in like, oh, because there's not like a ton of wins like up to now. It's usually a lot of like, you stunk at your job,
Yep.
you failed, you tried to make life work, and then you ended up at the doctor because you were going to die from coffee. Like all of these things are just like blah, blah, and then all of a sudden it's like, wait a minute, and now you're kind of on to something here. Is that, I assume that's very intentional.
Very intentional. That again, like the way I finished this chapter off. Um, Said I really loved those kids a lot. Um, I didn't want anything they lacked or thought they lacked to keep them from knowing how endlessly and relentlessly loved they were. All the while, I was learning something very similar about myself, something I needed a little help seeing. Not only was I loved in the same way I wanted those kids to be loved, but it was in fact my belovedness that I was passing on. Knowing myself the way I do now, I can say with confidence that I wasn't going to pray or meditate myself to a functional, embodied version of that knowledge. I had to feel it in me and see it played out in real life. I was in and through work. It was in and through work that I learned that I was the gift God was offering. Thank God Grant asked that question, and thank God Leah saw past my job to the person I was while I was doing it. In fact, thank God I dropped the ball and double booked that cabin and spent the night feeling like a failure, because I'm pretty sure I wouldn't have come to see myself as beloved if those things hadn't happened. This is the emotional turning point in the book in which I'm really coming to terms with my own belovedness as the actually centered story. Like, that is the story. I was wanting these kids to know that they were loved. I think that's the thing we're wanting in all of the relationships we're in and all of the work we're doing. I think as cheeseball as it sounds, I think loving people is it, and there is nothing else. The hard part of that is that only folks who know they are loved can actually fully love other people. Once I know I'm loved, I can actually do the work. I didn't believe I was loved fundamentally until I started failing enough and finding myself cared for and received anyways. This comes to play towards the tail end of the book where all this kind of comes to a head, and we'll do that time, we'll do it when the time comes. But trusting and believing my own belovedness on the other side of failure puts me in a position to actually do the work of my life, which is to love other people. This is the hinge point in the book where this starts to take place.
Excellent.
Well, dude, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
Appreciate it. And thank you for joining us on this episode of the Atsy Podcast. If you're digging this, and we think you should be, because it's a cool book. These are great stories. You can pick up the book kind of anywhere you get books. Maybe. Although if your whole book shopping thing is like all those tiny libraries in your neighborhood, it might not be there. But if you want a reliable place to pick up the book, you can go to heartsandmindsbooks.com and buy several copies from my friend Byron Borger, or you can go to amazon.com and just search my name, and there'll be several books along with this one there. Blessings, and until next time.